Okay. Hi, everyone. We'll continue our discussion about ecosystems and ecology. Previous two videos are talking about community structures and community interactions between members of the community. I want to talk a little bit about trophic levels. We talked about producers and consumers and food chains and food webs. I want to actually discuss here the foundation of those ideas, which is this idea of trophic levels, which is, or what trophic means, basically what this means, feeding levels, like what organisms feed on which level and what happens there. I'd like to point out that if you think about this, this is all based upon the movement of energy. There's an energy flow through these systems that is really key to understanding how this works. And I hinted at that in this previous videos. I want to be explicit about it now, right? So on the surface of the planet Earth, energy flows into the biological world from the sun, right? So the sun provides all the energy through light, right? And producers, right, the primary producers that we talked about earlier, capture and transform that sunlight into chemical energy through the process of photosynthesis. All right, so that's photosynthesis is a really important, actually foundational process by which light is used as an energy source to convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose or sugars, right? Which then can be used to power the functions of cells and organisms by anaerobic or aerobic respiration, producing ATP, which then allows these processes to work, right? Okay, so producers do this, and they actually use their own glucose as an energy supply, right? So they convert CO2 and water to glucose and then use that to actually make ATP, right? Then consumers come along, like predators, of course, and obtain energy by consuming plants, right? Those are primary consumers. And then secondary consumers would be eating other animals, secondary and tertiary consumers, and quaternary consumers, right? So these are all predators, right? Herbivores would be these, right? And then all the predators would be these guys, all right? So those are trophic levels and how we kind of organize them in these systems, right? So when a trophic level is basically just a feeding level composed of all organisms within an ecosystem feeding at the same energy level, right? So all organisms that are herbivores eating primary producers are called primary consumers, and that's a trophic level. And then secondary consumers would be the next trophic level up, right? So food chain is basically just how that energy from those organisms passes from in an ecosystem from one level to another in a kind of a linear path, right? One organism to another. But in a food web is a more complex interactions between, which I talked about earlier. But this is really about path of energy flow, right? How energy from these organisms moves from organism to organism as they consume each other, right? And it's not just linear. Actually, most systems is a web. This is complex. Multiple different organisms will eat any one particular type of prey, right? This can be pretty complex. Okay, so some terms we should be aware of. Producers, which we already talked about, use solar energy or some sorts of energy, not necessarily solar energy in all cases, but some sorts of energy to build energy-rich sugar molecules, right? Herbivores will eat plants. Those are primary consumers. Carnivores will eat animals. Those are usually secondary consumers, but also include tertiary and quaternary consumers, right? Omnivores eat both plants and animals, right? So humans are definitely omnivores. There's other animals that are too, like bears, for example, are often omnivores. And then there's detritivores and decomposers, which obtain energy from organic wastes and dead bodies, right? So these are things that are really important for recycling nutrients back to another state and moving energy around ecosystems so that they can be often recycled a little bit. Energy itself is not recycled ever, but the molecules that make up the biological molecules can be recycled, right? And these things connect all trophic levels to each other, right? So all organisms die at some point, and detritivores and being the decomposers are really important for taking those nutrients in those organisms and bringing them back for use for other organisms, right? Okay, now here's what energy and flow looks like and biomass flow. So if we talk about, here's the sun, the energy source, right? The orange arrow indicates energy flow. Those goes into primary producers, which use photosynthesis to make biomass, right? They make molecules, which they can use to make cells, which makes biomass, right? There's energy stored in that. That's the whole point of this exercise, is to store chemical energy, right? So that chemical energy can be transferred to primary consumers, but there's an inefficiency here, right? Primary producers will make energy-rich molecules using sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, but some of that's lost as heat. And of course, they metabolize some of this themselves to make ATP, right? And so some of this mass is actually lost in this level, right? And can't be all transferred to the primary consumers to consume it. Again, some of this is going to be lost as waste, detritus, stuff that can't be digested, whatever is not actually used, right? That becomes detritus, or well, mainly detritus, right? And some of its loss is heat. Some of the energy's loss is heat, right? So this is not 100% efficient. In fact, it's quite a bit less than 100% efficient. We'll get that in a second. Then secondary consumers will eat the primary consumers. Again, it's not going to be 100% efficient. You lose a lot as detritus. A lot of the energy is lost as heat, right? And then tertiary consumers up here, right? Now, the chemicals that come through all these organisms, nitrogen and phosphorus and various other things, metals and stuff, will tend to be recycled, right? And even the CO2 that's generated as a result of aerobic respiration will go out into the atmosphere here, like these blue lines here, and then be recycled, come back to the primary producers, right? Which will photosynthesize this and refix it into complex organic molecules, and then rebuild biomass, and this will continue on, right? So energy tends to be flow. It flows from the sun through these organisms and out as heat lost into the system, right? So energy tends not to be recycled, but the chemicals are. So the chemicals all cycle around and are recycled about 100% in organisms, at least over long periods of time, right? So here's what it looks like in a little more technical terms. We have energy source about 10 to 20 to 22nd power joules of energy per day from the sun reaching the surface of the earth. About 1% of that's captured by producers, which are also called autotrophs, self-feeders. They lose some of that as heat, as we talked about before, but this is something, this is then can be consumed by heterotrophs or consumers, which these are, right, by eating. And some of that energy, those joules of energy, which are now in chemical energy here, are transferred over to the heterotrophs to some extent, although not 100%. And some of that, again, energy is lost as heat and stuff, right? The nutrients that are used by the autotrophs to actually grow are then transferred over to heterotrophs also. And then eventually they'll die, or they'll get consumed by something else. And then those nutrients will be recycled back. So the nutrients are going to be cycling. Energy, though, is leaving one way. It's coming in from the sun and then going out as heat. All right, so here's an example of trophic levels. We saw this before. We have algae or something photosynthesizing in, let's say, a pond, right? And then we'll have certain small insects and various organisms eating that algae, right? And this would be the biomass of those types of organisms, indicating the size of this base of the block of this pyramid, right? And then sunfish will eat some of the insects that are eating the algae, but not as much, right? Because they will there'll be losses along the way. So there's not as much biomass of sunfish as there is biomass of insects. There's not as much biomass of insects, there is biomass of algae in the pond, right? And then like a top level tertiary consumer, like great blue heron, would be eating fish, right? So you have even fewer of those, right? Now, what the little dots here are showing is toxins that might be present in a pond environment like this being magnified. Remember, we talked about biomagnification earlier in the week. Bioaccumulation as part of the PBT assignment. This is what it's referring to. If you have a low level of stuff, let's say DDT or some chemical in the water, and it gets concentrated as it goes higher up on the food chain, right? So that the great blue heron now has a lot of this stuff, and that can be pretty nasty for that animal. Okay, so here's another example. This is a terrestrial example, right? We have producers using the sun to produce, and then the primary consumer will be grasshoppers, they're insects, and the secondary consumers will eat those to make moles and mice and whatever, small animals. And then tertiary consumers will come and eat those secondary consumers to make to convert their biomass into new biomass, right? All of these will die and become subjects of decomposers and detritivores. Here's a food web, more complex interactions than we talked about before, but basically the energy flows the same. Production's here, right? Photosynthesis going to primary consumers and secondary consumers and tertiary consumers, and then they're dying and being converted into new biomass as a result of decomposition. Here's another food web, right? So let's skip that. So, well, let's not skip that. So energy flows through ecosystems from point to point, and you can measure something called primary productivity, which is the total amount of light energy converted into organic compounds in a given area per unit time, right? So the whole Earth has a primary productivity, and then that can be moved from trophic level, and that's becomes a net primary productivity. Like that's energy that's lost is subtracted from the total primary productivity and gives you net primary productivity, right? We don't need to worry about it. We're not going to do anything with this. It's just an idea to keep in mind that you're going to make primary productivity as a result of converting sunlight into biomass, but a lot of that's going to be lost in ecosystems because of this energy loss as a result of respiration and various other inefficiencies. Okay, so here's a map of the Earth with primary productivity. The greener areas are the highest primary productivity on land, right? So this is where all the primary productivity on the planet really is. Actually, the oceans are actually less so. The red on the oceans, or the redder areas, tend to be the highest levels of photosynthesis going on, where all the chlorophyll is. For photosynthesis, you can see the oceans are actually not very active, actually, in some ways, right? With photosynthesis, that's why the ocean kind of blue, right, not green, okay? But the land has a lot of this going on, right? And there's certain areas along the coasts in the oceans where there's a lot of photosynthesis going on. There's usually at the mouths of rivers, like the Amazon, not the Amazon's here, and various other places, Black Sea, right here in Mississippi Delta, right? So areas where there's a lot of nutrients and stuff for a lot of productivity, right? So if you look at different areas of Earth and how productive they are, it turns out that areas that are on the coast that are water-based, but not deep ocean, tend to be the most productive, right? Estuary, swamps, and marshes, okay? Tropical rainforests are way up there, as you might imagine. Deciduous temperate rainforests, like one we live in here, pretty productive. Agricultural land's pretty productive, and then you go down like grasslands, lakes and streams, sandy beaches, tundras, open ocean, deserts, get less and less productive for various reasons, right? Like deserts are too dry, things don't grow well, and so you get a lot of productivity there. Makes sense. Okay, so there's this kind of interesting thing that happens, though, is that many ecosystems, you have areas which are not really productive because they're missing some key nutrient, right? So, for example, all organisms need nitrogen, phosphorus, and various things to grow, right? You need phosphorus for DNA and RNA synthesis, nitrogen for proteins and DNA and RNA production. So if you don't have certain nutrients, you're not going to grow very well, right? So you can have areas that are less productive than you might expect them to be. There's good environments, they have a lot of nutrients and stuff, but they're missing something that allows them to grow. And so, for example, in these areas along Long Island, right, they are usually not very productive, but there's these duck farms that have been established there, and they're dumping duck waste, which is high in nutrients, into some of these areas of these bays, and all of a sudden these things get really productive. And what seems to be happening here is that we're adding to these areas something called a limiting nutrient. There's a nutrient that's missing in these areas that keep growth of photosynthesizers, usually producers, down low, so it keeps them from getting growing really high levels. And you add the nutrient, and all of a sudden these things grow. So if you look at this graph here, this is phytoplankton. This is photosynthesizing cells in the water along the coast, right? And they grow very little down here, orange and kind of the orange bars here. And if you add phosphate, right, a nutrient, not a big difference. But if you add ammonia, which is nitrogen, huge differences. So the limiting nutrient here is nitrogen in the form of ammonia. And that is actually what's allowing these phytoplankton to grow a lot. If you don't have that nutrient, they don't grow well at all. All right, you can actually do this experiment in actual freshwater lakes. Here's a lake that's been 2 parts, has been dammed, and then 1 part has been fertilized with nitrogen and nitrogen and phosphorus, and 1 just with nitrogen, this one, right? And in this case, the phosphorus is a limited nutrient. You can see all the stuff's growing, turning the lake into a kind of a pale color, right? This is phosphorus is a limited nutrient. We know that because we added nitrogen to both of these. The only difference between them is that this one has phosphate added to it too, phosphorus added to it too, and all of a sudden it grows up. So phosphorus is the limited nutrient in this case. All right, another example, you can grow these Hudson Bay salt marsh plants, right, and then supplement them with different nutrients and get them to grow really well in the summer. This experiment was done in 1980, right? You add phosphorus, not a big difference. Here's the control, so the plants grow okay, not really vigorously. You add phosphorus, they don't grow much different. You add nitrogen, you get a little bit better, but you add nitrogen and phosphorus, you get both supplementing nutrients, and these things really take off growing well. So the limited nutrients, both nitrogen and phosphorus in this case, and they need to be used in tandem. Okay, so this results in this what we call a productivity pyramid, right? The producers tend to have the highest productivity, most biomass and energy stored in that biomass, and then of course the primary consumers have less because they're using the primary producers as their food source. So they're part of the pyramid's a little bit narrower. And then carnivores that are eating the primary consumers tend to have even less biomass, and then secondary, tertiary consumer or tertiary quaternary consumers have even less, right? So this is the amount of energy stored in any particular ecosystem at any one time will have a structure somewhere like this. Lots of plants, less primary consumers, even less secondary consumers, and even less tertiary consumers. All right, now, this results in what's called the 10% rule, that between any level, trophic level, there's about 10% biomass that can be converted from one level to the next, right? And that is as a result of something like this. If you have a caterpillar, it's a primary consumer, right? It's eating primary productivity. It will convert, if it takes 200 joules of glucose in, or biomass in, it'll convert about 33 of those joules, about 15% to growth, right? Most of it's lost, a good chunk of it's lost is cellular respiration, and then a huge piece of it, half of it's lost is feces, just basically detritus, right? Just not digestible and usable by the organism. So only about 15% of this biomass is actually usable. And this is true for almost every organism that eats another organism. There's this inefficiency. Much of it loses waste, some of it loses cellular respiration. In this case, it's about 15%, right? Then it varies from ecosystem to ecosystem. So the ecologists have come up with this thing called, they kind of round it off to about 10%. Okay, so here's some examples. Here's a Florida bog. Here's the weight of organisms in grams, which is basically a proxy for the amount of biomass, right? And primary producers quite high, primary consumers quite low. This is actually less than 10% in this case. And then secondary consumers lower, and then tertiary consumers even less, right? You can have situations where this is weird, like you have a primary productivity where the biomass is actually low here, right? And then the secondary consumers is quite high, but there's probably something going on here. This is measured in biomass at any particular time. But if you measure this over time, this biomass is constantly recycling. So it's constantly growing fast to replace everything that's eaten. And that, over time, there's actually more biomass produced at this level than there is in primary consumers. It's just that any particular time, the biomass is low, right? But it's turning over very rapidly. So this basis pyramid is actually quite a bit bigger. Okay, so this can be seen in a number of organisms sometimes too. Like here's Michigan bluegrass field, 5.8 million primary producers, right? And there's only 708,000 roughly primary consumers and 354,000 secondary consumers and only 3 tertiary consumers, right? Now, this is not measuring the actual size of the organism, but just basically a rough proxy of these relationships by numbers of organisms. Okay, now, humans. We are generally in this kind of category where we have corn or wheat or something as our primary production in agriculture. And then we often, us that eat meat, we'll take cattle, let them eat corn, which is a certain loss, right? And you get certain amount of that biomass converted into cattle, and then humans eat that. And this is inefficient, right? So you can only support so many humans eating cattle who are eating stuff that we've grown by agriculture, right? Much more efficient is if you are go vegetarian, right? Humans directly eating the plants, you convert about 10% of that biomass of plants into humans, and you can have it support a much larger mass of humans on the planet, right? And this raises question of carrying capacity of the earth and what it is actually, based upon how much primary productivity there is and how humans actually consume it. How many humans can the earth support, right? And doing it this way, not so many. Doing it this way is much more. Kind of an interesting problem. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop here. Yeah, stop here and make another video for the rest of this later on.